Are we on? We
We
are
are
indeed
live.
live. We are live, and it is wonderful to be again with the great and amazing Robert Barnes. And since Alex cannot join us because, well, all kinds of reasons connected to YouTube, which we're not going to discuss in detail here, but which prevent him from joining us and participating in our work for a week on YouTube. Let me stress he's working as hard as always. You can find him on Locals, you can find him on Rumble, you can find him on Telegram, but you can't join us today, not on this program. Anyway, without Alex, it's just me. And first of all, can I just say thank you to our moderators? I'm sure you're all there. But first of all, a great thank you to Robert Barnes for joining us again. And I'm going to just ask the question Alex always starts these programs with. Robert, where can we find you?
Yeah, everybody can find me at vivabarneslaw.locals.com, just as you can find Alex at the Duran.locals.com, especially needed in this age of increasing censorship and control of the narrative that will become more and more desperate as the narrative becomes more and more obviously false. It's kind of like, it's amazing how we're living through like old Soviet times in the sense that, they lie. I forget the exact quote, but they lie to us. They know they're lying to us. They know we know they're lying to us, and so they continue to do so because it's like the ultimate exercise in power, and the attempts to manipulate the narrative are extraordinary.
Absolutely. In fact, there's been I don't know whether you know him at all, but there's quite a good piece by Matt Taibbi, who I used to remember once upon a time. He used to do he used to co-author with Mark Ames and a newspaper for expats in Moscow called The Exile, which is quite an extraordinary creation actually. But anyway, he's done a really interesting piece actually about how the New York Times is increasingly becoming an exercise in Kremlinology. You have to sort of pass every article, and it's not that much better here, by the way. I mean, we're going through a very, very bizarre leadership election here in Britain to choose our new prime minister. Notice that the people are not being consulted in any of this, and most of the people I live in Britain. I'm politically interested. After all, I work on the Duran. I can absolutely tell you most of the people who are participating. Well, Rishi Sunak I know about because he was our chancellor. Tom Tugendhat I've also known about, but pretty much all the others are just unknowns to me. I mean, where have they come from? It's like some kind of, mysterious process. It's like, what used to happen, in the Kremlin, that, a well-known face would suddenly disappear and someone you'd never heard of would suddenly emerge, only again to disappear a bit later. But that's the world we're in. Well, Robert, can I just say we have an enormous amount going on, and the centerpiece always is the US. And first of all, I wanted to just say that you were absolutely right. You predicted Roe and Wade, the decision wouldn't make a difference. And you're completely right. I mean, I think we're looking at the opinion polls. We're looking at the president's, approval ratings. They're actually plunging. In fact, the way he responded to the Supreme Court decision seems to have weakened him. It seems to have upset everybody. So, I mean, that has not helped at all. But we have a president who's now falling all the time in the polls. We have a very difficult economic picture in the US. We have inflation now at 9.1%. That's the official figure. I don't think anybody takes that very seriously. I certainly don't. I'm sure it's higher than that. I'm not going to say how much higher. I don't have the statistical knowledge or the data to be able to say, but I feel it's certainly higher than people are saying. And we have a very, very peculiar picture in the economy, which I'm sure people in the US who are watching this program understand perhaps better than I do. But I get the feeling that people are now under a lot of pressure in the US. The only thing I'm going to say to them is, bad as the things are with you, here in Europe, they are worse. just before we started this program, we got the news that the Italian government has collapsed, that the Prime Minister of Italy, Mario Draghi, has been forced to resign. Now, that's perhaps not unusual. The Italian governments often collapse, but this was supposed to be the stable, technocratic government that was going to last a long time, certainly for, until next year, and it's already collapsed. And if anybody tells you that's not connected with the economic crisis, it absolutely is. And we've had elections in France, which have been left the French president looking increasingly like a lame duck, though he doesn't seem to know what to do. And I was talking about this political contest to be prime minister in Britain. And I was reading an article just a few hours ago in the Daily Telegraph, a newspaper which supports the governing Conservative Party, complaining that none of these people who want to be prime minister in Britain are addressing the enormous crisis, the economic crisis that we are facing in Britain. And earlier today, the euro fell below parity with the dollar. So, I mean, that gives you a sense of how grim things are in Europe. But I think that tells you more, actually, about the underlying resilience and strength of the US economy. Europe, big continental country, you have to do an enormous amount of damage to the US before things really, before things really start to crack in the way that they are in Europe, rather than it tells you anything about any superior quality of economic governance in the US. Because to be straightforward about it, I really don't see it. And I mean, the Treasury Secretary, Janet Yellen, is still going around telling everybody that she wants this this price cap on Russian oil. Every single economist I've seen, every single commentator I've read tells us that this isn't going to work, and yet she still talks about it. She's threatening the Russians with a withdrawal of insurance if they don't comply, unaware that the European Union has already said that it's actually going to withdraw insurance cover for Russian oil shipments at the end of this year. So, I mean, contradictions all over the place. And she's just the Treasury Secretary, probably one of the more capable people in this administration, or so it seems to me. And the president, who is presiding, if that's the right word, over this whole situation, he's now on the way to the Middle East. He's just been to Israel. He's made commitments over Iran, which I have to say look to me dangerously like a blank check. And, that's not in any way to say, that I'm siding with Iran on any particular issue. It did seem to me like he was giving the Israelis what looked to me very much like a blank check. Does he quite understand what the implications of that are? And then, heavens help us, he's due to meet the Saudi leadership, MBS, and all that, very, very helpful group of people. So the president, I think, frankly, at sea, he doesn't seem to know when his speeches end and when they start. Criticisms of him starting to appear in the media, an economic situation that's looking very bleak. And I think most likely, since this is still the US, a major political change coming. Have I got this roughly right, Robert? I mean, am I getting the situation in the US roughly right?
No doubt. I think what we're all waiting for is for there to be interruption in all broadcast and Black Swan to come on the TV, Soviet style. Just to announce a sudden change of regimes indirectly. I was watching a documentary on Chernobyl, and I didn't realize the degree to which the Soviet Union had just tried to gaslight their entire nation for about 2 years, and suggesting that Chernobyl had no problems. That if you have if your baby's being born with fish feet, if you have animals running around with legs sticking out of the side of their head, don't worry. That's your phobia of radioactivity.
Yeah.
Of course, the some speculate that it was as important or more important than anything else in the final collapse of the Soviet Union. But the only added aspect to all of this is, given this sort of mass medical experimentation we're doing in the United States with a particular drug, the likely, if there are continued reports of problems related to that drug, as that drug is now being expanded to kids as young as 6 months old, as hospitals are talking about in the United States, and one in Vanderbilt, Tennessee, tried to deny emergency medical care unless they injected their child with this drug. As the problems accumulate and Chernobyl-style side effects occur, that's just going to add to the problems as there's been an institutional discrediting of even the public health authorities, which has already partially occurred here due to the lockdown economics and politics, for which we're still feeling the effect and impact. So you add that to everything else, and you get a sense of, a black swan type Soviet-style end to the Biden regime and institutional democratic power, and institutional power in general of a certain globalist-minded elites in the United States, and everybody's just on the clock. And you look at inflation; it continues to be higher than they said it would be. The Fed continues to raise interest rates, and what may happen? There's a mythology here that Paul Volcker cured inflation with higher interest rates deliberately, intentionally in the early 80s. However, if you go back and read some of the Fed history, they didn't even know what they were doing. They were just kind of guessing. And there's an economic interpretation by Jeff Snyder and George Gammon and others that the Fed doesn't have as much control as they're pretending to have. I have an existing FOIA request to deal with from the Federal Reserve. They've been playing games. We're probably going to sue them coming up in the fall, George Gammon and I, because they refuse to produce any of the documents or information about what they've been up to over the last 2 years, as well as a broader historical context of Fed information. And it may be that the Fed will simply sink the stock market and the real estate market here, because we're running into additional economic issues in that we're getting backup inventories on discretionary items. So there you may see a price collapse and an economic problems on that side of the aisle. While the essential items, the very items that are not going up much in Russia, food and fuel and things that depend on fuel for its major input cost, here are skyrocketing. Like the official rate is 9.1%. Shadow Stat says if we were using the old metrics, same data, just different formula that we used to use in the 1970s, the actual inflation rate last month was 17.1%. And so when you're looking at something, and that's the highest rate they have found in 75 years.
Yeah.
And then you go further in and you look at the essential items that you don't have a choice. You don't have a choice on your heating or your air conditioning bill. You don't have a choice on your electric bill. You don't have a choice on your gas for your car bill. If you're a trucker, you don't have a choice on your diesel bill. You don't have a choice on your food bill. These items are in some places as high as 50%. So skyrocketing food and fuel inflation. And while still, as you note, nowhere near as bad as where continental Europe is. I mean, the euro is now below the dollar. It's just stunning. A good time to travel if you're in the States. If you get over to Europe, first time it's been really cheap in a while. But we're still facing unparalleled, to some degree, economic issues here, compounded with a potential looming public health crisis. As one of the super chats mentioned, there's this talk of trying to gin up another lockdown style reaction, or at least more mandates and whatnot, based on a return of COVID. And I think for a range of reasons that won't actually happen, because I don't think they have the political capital to pull it off at this point in time. We're still feeling the ramifications, and there's been no honest addressing of it. In other words, there's been nobody saying, you know what, maybe spending all that money. The European banker was recently on, and someone said, look at the size of the Fed, not just the Fed, but of the European central bank's balance sheet, and how it's not coming down much. Like all we've done here is flatline a little bit. And what may happen is the Fed's policies may pop the stock market in the United States. People like the Big Short's Michael Berry predicting as much as a 50% decline. may pop the housing market. I track a lot of housing markets in the United States. For the first time, inventories are backing up. For the first time in several years, and for the first time in several years, prices are starting to decline. And a lot of people use their housing value, their equity, to help keep themselves afloat economically. And then you compound that with there's really not the availability to print stimmy checks, like though California's trying. California's trying to solve inflation by writing more checks to people. You look at all of that in aggregate, as well as the ongoing disaster of the economic war against Russia on a global scale, the imminent failure of the military efforts in Russia, in Ukraine on a geopolitical and military scale. And all you see is disaster after disaster after disaster after disaster. And we're coming up on the anniversary of last year's Afghanistan debacle.
Yeah.
So, it's and that doesn't, and then there's a massive leak. Somebody on 4chan, apparently, could always be somebody else up to something else, but leaked all of Hunter Biden's materials, which revealed a degree of depravity that would make the, Caligula and aspects of Rome blush. I mean, it's just, Sodom and Gomorrah would feel ashamed at the behavior of Hunter Biden. And then how broad does that go? I mean, how blackmailable has the whole family been for decades now? At least for a decade.
Yeah.
And the complicity of Joe Biden this whole time, and how much has the media been suppressing? Because clearly you have addiction, you have addictive behavior, and you have almost cry out behavior. How did the two kids of the president continue to accidentally leave behind diaries, accidentally leave behind laptops, accidentally have poor password protections, accidentally have film everything? I mean, Elon Musk even made a joke of it the other day. I mean, that, whenever Hunter Biden is near crack or hookers, all of a sudden he's got 6 cameras ready to roll. And this doesn't even get into the very disturbing interfamily behavior that is being detailed in aspects of these texts and comments. So we look like the end of Rome, but I don't remember the end of Rome having a dementia candidate as their emperor.
No, they didn't. Absolutely not. Can I just say, just briefly on the topic of Russia, because we don't want to get too absorbed in this, perhaps, because as I say, we want to talk about things closer to home a bit. But in Russia, they had deflation in June and apparently in most of July. So retail prices are falling. They went up too high in March in response to the sanctions, and they're coming down again. So what that actually means is that real wages are rising because people were given money to cover them for the inflation increases. Now they got that money to spend, and the government wants them to spend that money because they're worried that there's insufficient demand at the moment in the economy. Now, you may agree with that or not, but that's their particular situation. And I think what Robert is just describing is absolutely right. What the Fed is doing by raising interest rates, they may not understand this, but this is the danger, that they're going to target the wrong inflation. I mean, we've had over the last 20, 30 years a huge increase in asset prices, in stocks, in houses, in all those sort of things. Now, people don't call it inflation. And, I'm not going to say that there isn't some actual value growth there as well. I mean, there is no doubt there was some sort of value growth, but there was an element, nobody, I think, really disputes this, as an aspect of this, which is a bubble aspect. And they're going to prick that bubble, and they're going to cause asset prices to fall. At the same time, what they're doing is not going to bring down retail prices, the prices of things you buy in the shops. And that's, of course, precisely the kind of price increases that are affecting people. And the reason they're not going to do that, or probably won't do that, is because these problems that we see with retail prices of fuel, of petrol, of every kind of price of that nature, is because these are caused by supply issues. Major supply issues made much worse this year by the sanctions war. And that is going to have a crushing effect on the economy, because with asset prices falling at the same time as retail prices are rising, and of course with interest rates also rising, it's impossible to see how that can prevent how you can prevent in that kind of scenario a basic collapse in investment and demand. So we could very, very well see the economy go down very far. Not as far as the European, because we have structural problems which you simply do not have in the United States. And can I say, I mean, there is a bottom below which, in my opinion, the US will not fall. I mean, the US still has enormous economic strengths, which in that kind of situation will come to the rescue of the economy, but they're not going to come to the rescue of the administration, and deservedly so. And we're going to see, I predict, I'm sure Robert will tell us much more about this, but we're going to see mounting challenges, a gathering political crisis at the heart of the administration over the next few weeks and months, because there must be growing worry that the captain isn't guiding the ship, or if he is, he's guiding it straight towards the iceberg, the political iceberg. There must be growing concerns about what's going to happen in the midterms, and I'd be astonished if the Democrats aren't worried about that too. And you mentioned the scandals with the son and his laptops. They must be increasingly worried about that, and one wonders why all that's coming out now and what's all that's all about. So there's going to be a growing political crisis, and at a time when the US needs, a steady pair of hands at the wheel. We don't have that, and we're going to have a political crisis instead. Now, something has to change, and I think it will change, and I think it will change soon. But perhaps, Robert, you can tell us a little bit about what you think is going to happen over the next few weeks, because this is getting very dramatic, or so it seems to me.
Yeah, you get a kind of a schizophrenic approach from the Democratic Party. So you'll see articles and suggestions that everything will really be fine, that Democrats will bounce back, that these are temporary and transitory issues, the kind of the way they said inflation was. And so you see that reflected in part of the community, even though the January 6th committee hearings finally wrapped up, and they never established what they needed. In fact, the biggest news that came out of the January 6th hearings didn't even come from the hearings. It came from John Bolton yipping away on CNN about all the coups he does.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, I do coups all the time. Coups are hard work. You have to, that's industrial. It takes skill. It takes skill to do coups. And then admitted specifically that Venezuela was one of the places he had been trying to do it. That used to be kind of a public admission of criminal behavior, but leave it to Bolton to just yip about that. That's going to be seminal now. That's going to show up in like documentaries and other things for the next next 3 or 4 decades. It did not. The reason why Bolton launched on that whole routine was he was realizing that January 6th was not working the way the anti-Trumpers wanted it to work. Most Americans didn't care. It had terrible ratings despite Twitter and everybody else promoting the heck out of it. And it's just not going to resonate. Instead, the biggest news otherwise that came out about January 6th was the meme of locking up grandmas actually came true. They locked up a grandma. Not only they locked up a grandma, they locked up a grandma with cancer. So they're putting that person in prison while Hunter Biden gets to commit crimes on a daily basis, the son of the president, without any consequence. So these are the real scandal continues to be the Biden administration and the Biden family and the Biden history, and the degree of depravity and the degradation of American political public life that he personally and his family individually signifies. But then the other thing the establishment has to worry about is his various continuous verbal faux pas. So as you mentioned, he goes to Israel and he says, "Let's all honor the Holocaust." It's like Israel, like, I don't think that's what. But and of course, last week he got caught reading the teleprompter so bad He said, "End of quote. Repeat the line." And the media had to pretend, "Oh no, that was deliberate." The White House went in and changed some of the language. Oh no, he was supposed to say "end of quote, repeat the line." It's just everybody, left and right, makes fun of the guy.
Yeah.
So when his approval rating in media polls that already are inflated. Even Nate Cohen admitted this of the New York Times, that the polls will be off and will predict Democrats doing better than they actually will do, because the polls can't get working class, a good subsample of working class voters. The only one that really has done a good job of that is Richard Barris at the People's Pundit.
Yeah.
And his polling is showing that, like, if the presidential election were, and here's the problem they face, the closest, most competitive with Trump in a 2024 election currently is Joe Biden. Kamala Harris loses by double digits. You're talking about a victory right now that we haven't seen in America since 1984. Is the scale at which Trump would win, and Republicans would sweep it. We broke down with Richard Barris the House races, and it's pretty clear right now that Republicans are heading to winning more seats than maybe they've ever had since the 1920s, and over 250 seats, picking up more than 50 seats. They might be able to pick up as many as 70 seats, which would give them a massive edge. And then a lot of those Republicans are the most populist Republicans that have been in the House of Representatives since the 1920s. You're talking about a populist caucus that I think it was 55 votes. It ended up being against the Ukrainian package. With the new group of people coming in, that could be over 100 kind of level of opposition to deep state policies, which is, again, unheard of since the 1920s. So the Senate the same, and the more populist anti-war voices. Just J.D. Vance is going to win in Ohio, and it won't even be close. They're trying to convince themselves it's close. It's not. Blake Masters is now going to win in Arizona, and win by a better margin, safer margin than a lot of Republicans have in that state in recent elections. And he, of course, also was one of the more anti-war voices within the Republican Party in terms of primary candidates. Eric Greitens is doing very competitively well, despite Karl Rove and others trying to take him out in Missouri. And he, again, is the much more anti-war voice compared to Eric Schmidt. Schmidt went on about supporting Ukraine, all this garbage after the war started, whereas Greitens came out and said, this is not our war. This is not our conflict. Let's not get further involved. So the Trumpian position, the people who've taken that are going to get elected in November. So you're all of a sudden going to have much more of a populist anti-war voice than has ever had. Now, the deep state still have a majority control in both halls of Congress, no matter what happens in 2022. It's just their potency, their power, their monopoly is rapidly disappearing. And so I think you combine that with the economic issues and the public health issues. Basically, Biden has every scandal, every problem that kills a president. He's got personal scandals, a sinking economy, and a foreign war debacle. He's managed to do all three. Almost nobody's done all three. This guy's breaking all kinds of records. They're just the wrong records to break.
That's so interesting that you mentioned 1984, because, of course, I remember that election incredibly well. I remember the previous election, the 1980 election. And the thing is that I think people realize what a fundamental change in America those elections were. In 1980, the Republicans actually, being made. First of all, Reagan won conclusively in 1980. He got a landslide in 1984. You saw the Republicans for the first time winning, I think, one of the houses in Congress. And bear in mind that up to that point, with a brief brief exception period in the early 50s, the Democrats had controlled both houses of Congress since the New Deal. And of course, all of that came at a time of great malaise in the US. We had inflation. There was the after effects of Vietnam, the war in Vietnam, which had gone hideously wrong. And by the way, which the Democrats, it all started under a Democrat administration, something people surprisingly never remember in my experience. But anyway, that's another story. There was the aftershock of that. There was the terrible business in Iran with the hostages and the botched rescue effort, which was very ill conceived. We had a president who was clearly not in control, Jimmy Carter. So frankly, compared to Joe Biden, he looks like a managerial. He seems like he was a managerial genius, and he was a decent human being. I mean, whatever else you think about Carter, he was in person a decent person, a human being. But anyway, you had this terrible sense of malaise, and then there was this sweep in the early 1980s, and the mood in America changed. And what was so interesting about it is I can also remember how incredibly unwelcome it was amongst the cognoscenti opinion in Europe. The Europeans didn't like it at all. I remember all the jokes they used to make about Reagan. I mean, some of the comedy sketches that used to appear at that time, that he had that he, they were, that he was a sort of dim wit and, wasn't really in charge. And they didn't like Reagan. They didn't like the Republicans very much. They didn't like the sort of change that took place. Even though, of course, they wanted or said they wanted the US to remain strong because it's, the country that still was part of NATO, but they didn't want a Republican change, and they got it. And as I said, I have to say, I mean, there's lots of comments, lots of people said lots of things about the Reagan era, but overall, I have to say this, it was enormously therapeutic for America. It transformed the nation's morale. I mean, you only have to look at the films that were being made before and the films that were being made after, and you see the sudden and dramatic shift in mood. And that's, I think, one of the great differences between the US and Europe. Because in Europe, we just don't have that ability to change over in that kind of dramatic way. Now, can I just ask Robert? I mean, if we are looking at a sort of landslide on that scale, what do you think the Republicans are going to do once they have won that landslide in the midterms and they're going to take over Congress and the new Congress convenes in January? And what are they going to do? I mean, are they going to start investigations? Are they going to start looking at the kind of things we've been talking about, the extraordinary combination of King Lear and Caligula, the kind of administration that he's running? Are they going to start doing that? And are they going to start making real investigations, perhaps taking it even further? Is impeachment going to be played?
Yeah, I think where we won't see a lot of progress is the legislative proposals or any legislation that will pass, because two reasons. The populist caucus within the Republican Party will be as big as it's ever been, but it will still be a minority of the Republican caucus, or at least not enough of a majority to dictate Speaker of the House, Majority Leader of the Senate. But there'll be populist voices pushing certain proposals that will be part of Trump's agenda come 2024. And the people to watch will be people like J.D. Vance, people like Blake Masters, if Eric Greitens is, if Joe Kent is there in the Congress, in the House, still with Matt Gaetz and Marjorie Taylor Greene and the rest. They'll be starting to set the legislative agenda and hopefully start proposing institutional reform. And I think that will probably be pushed in part on the justice side of the equation by Steve Bannon's trial this coming week in the District of Columbia, where he's basically been stripped of any meaningful defense. And he's publicly said that a jury trial in D.C. is basically a joke. It's just political witch hunts, political prosecutions, which his case will further highlight along the right, while doing minimal damage to conservative causes on the left. And so, so you'll continue to see that. Now, you're absolutely correct. The only place they effectively can go, since they can't get legislation through, there's not a real strong populist control of the House and the Senate and the Republican caucus side of the equation to even get it through the House or the Senate. And of course, Biden would veto anything that's really populist on the conservative side in all likelihood. That means in order to satisfy their base for delivering them the House and the Senate, they've got to do investigations. They've got to do impeachment inquiries. And I think that will happen. And there's been so much leaked now from the Hunter Biden cache of information that provides by itself 20 different subject matters. And now that, there's allegations that Biden shifted oil to China in a deal of a company that's connected to Hunter. It's fascinating. We're escalating rhetoric against China, and then we're doing these secret deals behind. It's like, what the heck? So I think there is a part of the deep state that would like to shift the military conflict to China, which is just kind of insane to me. But I don't think it will actually result in that. Despite their relative insanity after back-to-back debacles with Afghanistan and now Ukraine. But there's always a risk of it. You can't rule anything out, sadly, with this administration. But I see it as, he'll face investigation after investigation. Now, my view has always been that if the deep state apparatus decides he needs to go, they'll start to leak, criminal grand juries investigation and things like that. And the pitch to Biden will be, go ahead and step down, and either Hunter gets pardoned and the family, because also it's Biden's sister and brother that are deeply involved in all of this. It's on the lobbying, consulting, corruption side. And then what's coming out on the personal side suggests family-related issues of a very disturbing kind. People can look it up for themselves. I try to avoid the actual images that come out of this data dump because they are not good. But references to family members as pedo this and things like that. This is not good.
No.
Discussions internally about whether somebody did something wrong with somebody's family member of a particular manner. So this is just sick stuff.
Yes.
So they got a lot of stuff to work with, and they can probably work with it in a range of ways. And if the deep state figures Biden needs to be a sacrificial lamb after the midterms, they have an easy pitch to make to him. Step down. No further investigations into you or your family. Just retire to Delaware. Now, their problem, of course, is Kamala Harris is not particularly popular. In fact, deeply unpopular. Like I said, she loses by worse margins to Trump than anybody. And the guy that was the real deep state guy inside the White House is Pete Buttigieg. So Buttigieg was deeply backed by they were choosing between a lot of those Wall Street defense industry, Silicon Valley actors. So you could call them deep state, call them national security state, label them whatever you want. Political establishment, but particularly the neoliberal political establishment, people who hate Bernie Sanders, for example. That group initially chose Kamala Harris because they thought black female, we can recreate Obama, et cetera. Not realizing, never been in a competitive race, history of just making imbecilic decisions. I've always said she's still the dumbest lawyer I ever had to deal with in court. She failed the bar for a reason, folks. People getting to witness this in live time. She was a very poor choice for Biden to make, though she was kind of deep state insurance to keep the agenda. But she's so unpopular that if they're trying to really take Biden out, the sophisticated play would be to take out Harris first. But like they did Nixon. Right now, Agnew was impeachment insurance, so they took out Agnew first, put Ford in there, and thereby was able to then take out Nixon confidently, and then Ford brings in Rockefeller, which told a lot of stories right there. But initially they tried to substitute Agnew with Rockefeller, but that was just too brazen even for deep state apparatchiks. But so if they're smart, they would try to take out Kamala and replace her with Buttigieg, because they think Buttigieg is sort of like the white gay Obama. And he kind of proved in the Democratic primaries early on that he has appeal to the current Democratic base, which is, I would say it's institutional base. Its voting base is still minority working class voters, but he never appealed to them at all. And they don't care about those voters at all. They only care about white professional class liberals. I think Tucker Carlson was on with somebody the other day. He's like, I'm not racist. The classic person I hate is a white professional class liberal. That's who I hate. He added a woman with a barren life, but that's Tucker being Tucker. He had to twist in a little dig. But that would be like the signs that they're really planning on a replacement, is if they replace Kamala first with someone like Buttigieg. Obviously, Gavin Newsom spots an opportunity. That's why, Biden goes off to the Mideast and Newsom gets photoshot walking around the White House. Newsom and Harris have a long-standing rivalry, because this all goes back to San Francisco Democratic politics, One wing was the Dianne Feinstein, Nancy Pelosi wing, from which Gavin Newsom is literally related by family. The other wing was Willie Brown, and Willie Brown brought in Kamala Harris. So Kamala Harris was that. Those two sides have always been opposed to one another, both based out of San Francisco, which tells you where Democratic Party politics is these days. I suspected, and there are some California political folks that also suspected, that Harris was quietly pushing for the recall of Newsom to undermine, not for him to actually be recalled, but from that to face a recall, to undermine his credibility in Washington political circles with how popular he is as a viable presidential candidate, because down deep they're at odds. A lot of people suspected Harris was the one leaking information about Dianne Feinstein's bad health, or being too old, because she wanted to replace her with her own Senate pick. She was the one that was behind the current Senate pick that replaced her. So there's been a political war there that it wouldn't be a surprise if it spilled over into a presidential contest. It's the New York Times and CNN both highlighted this past week how everybody hates Biden, even within the Democratic Party. You know how 90% of them, Biden got prickly about it at a press conference, but even 90% of them, of young Democrats, said they don't want Biden to run for re-election. Now, in practice, all those candidates, like Jimmy Carter in 1980, survive a challenge. He survived a challenge from no less than a Kennedy. Now, Ted Kennedy kind of ran a weak race, but he still survived that challenge. Biden would be the same, because there's nobody that can break into the working class Democratic base that could challenge Biden effectively. And so he might take some hits in Iowa and New Hampshire, but after that he would coast. But it's a sign that the media, that CNN is highlighting how unpopular he is. That all suggests there's increasing motivation to replace him. I think they'll wait for the midterms to see what happens. And if there's a wipeout of the kind that I'm talking about, 4 to 5 Senate seats, 50 plus House seats, then I think there'll be moves afoot to replace him. If it's a sophisticated effort, they'll try to replace Harris first and make Buttigieg the candidate to oppose Trump in 2024. There's some talk here of DeSantis. I know from DeSantis's people, he will not challenge Trump. Won't challenge. So that's on Trump. If Trump fell apart for some reason, or didn't run, or had a health problem, then DeSantis is the likely replacement. But right now, there's also talk that they'll try to do an October surprise and indict Trump in the fall in D.C. That, I think, 2 problems with that. One, they are more afraid of DeSantis in 2024, Democrats are, than they are of Trump. And so if they were actually successful at politically tarring Trump enough by an indictment, what they get is a DeSantis candidacy, which is probably not good for them. And that's why I think they'll be hesitant to pull the trigger on that, whereas they otherwise might have been gung-ho. But right now what we're looking at is Republican sweep, lots of investigations. Probably I don't think at this point Biden survives to 2024 being on the ballot, given the way things are going. Just too much is coming out. Too many things are falling apart. It's harder and harder for the media to hide that he is a pure dementia candidate at this point, that too many problems, and they'll need and want and seek a sacrificial lamb. Their only hurdle is they don't have a substitute. If it's real sophisticated, they'll replace Kamala Harris before all this happens. If it's not real sophisticated, then it'll be kind of sloppy. And that's what a lot of people are seeing. I've been watching European and Eastern European and Russian and Chinese and Indian and Latin American interpretations of U.S. policy. And you have more and more people, like Russians with attitude and others, saying, you know what, the incompetency explanation is increasingly the more likely explanation for the Western deep state, for the globalist policies, than is mischievous malevolence. Because there's more and more evidence there wasn't ever a grand plan, and these people are not super bright. And the lockdown economics prove that. Russia global policies has proven that. Their reaction to everything since and their handling of everything since has proven that. And I think they'll only continue unabated. So, yeah, it's looking like a nightmarish fall and next winter for Joe Biden in particular.
Absolutely. Now, I mean, the thing I find astonishing about all of this, first of all, what you're describing is Kremlin politics. I mean, this is exactly, because I studied the Soviet Union, and I remember it. Of course, when I was a student, it was still, up and running after a fashion anyway. But I mean, it was Malenkov versus Khrushchev. It was all that kind of thing. Kozlov versus Brezhnev. I mean, factions and people pulling the wires from behind the scenes, and and I mean. The Democratic Party, one of the great institutions of the US, has descended to this is quite astonishing. Now, I will say this because I also studied US history. I mean, there was always more of this going on in the Democratic Party than there was in the Republican Party, all the way back to the 19th century. I mean, you had Tammany Hall, for example. You had that kind of style of democratic politics. But I mean, this is completely out of control. And I have to say, you talk about a sophisticated operation, getting rid of Kamala Harris because she's unpopular and putting someone else instead. Given the deep factionalization, the risk, if they try to do that, is they'll botch it. they'll do it in a way that, far from actually helping them, actually makes things worse. And I have to say, the idea also of indicting Trump. Now, I'm sure that that's what some of them want to do, because they have this visceral obsession with Trump and they're frightened of him. I mean, let's be straightforward about it. They are frightened of him. But indicting Trump is about the biggest political mistake, or so it seems to me, that they could possibly make. I mean, it's not going to help them politically at all. It's going to simply confirm to a very large part of the country that the Democrats are out to get him. I mean, that it's not going to play well at all in the country. So, it's Kremlin politics, but it's bad Kremlin politics. I mean, this is how it's shaping out. I mean, at least the Russians, when they did it, they did it in a kind of style. I mean, it was their way of doing things, if you like. Now, the other thing I just wanted to ask about Biden, I mean, he's come into the presidency. He was the candidate. He was the person who was elected, nominated to be the Democratic Party candidate. Now, all of this information that we've been talking about, all of these things, I mean, I always understood that candidates of political parties, people that the parties nominated to stand for president, were vetted and investigated and checked out thoroughly. Is it really conceivable that people in the Democratic Party, the leadership of the Democratic Party, didn't know about all of this with Biden? And surely they must have realized that if they put forward a candidate like this, with this enormous amount of baggage behind him, there was a real danger that this could all explode. Or am I missing something?
No, I mean, I've told people, do a confession through projection analysis of aspects of the Russian-Ukrainian conflict. So if Ukraine puts out Russian casualties, assume they're putting out their own casualties, as an example. And the same has been true of what the Democrats and the media accuse Trump of ends up being a script for what Biden is. And the same with like Putin right now. Like, you listen to what they're saying about Putin, and there's, secret health problems, lots of internal coup plotting, all kinds of corruption scandals, different scandals of ineptitude in policy. Basically, they're describing Biden is what they're really doing. So it's a lot of confession through projection. The old telltale heart has to speak of its own sins, but they do so by saying someone else is guilty of their own. And I think that explains part of the sort of some of the craziness and zaniness that we have seen. But I think there's no doubt that they knew, because that's what the latest Hunter Biden leaks exposed, is this was so out of control by Hunter Biden for years and years that there's no way the deep state didn't know. There's no way institutional players in D.C. didn't know. It makes people like Lindsey Graham and all the statements that they made about how great a character Joe Biden is really questionable. So There's no doubt they did. And this reflects back to the unusual nature in which Biden got elected in the first place. Typically, somebody like him will win the nomination when the incumbent is strong, but then gets wiped out in the general. But for the lockdowns, which allowed for new methods of voting, which allowed for unusual turnout patterns, Biden is not elected in the first place. The second part is he was the first nominee in the history of either party to lose the first 3 election contests. And not only lose them in the first 2, not even finish in the top 3. So that was a warning sign. And this was not only that, this was the 3rd time these Iowa and New Hampshire had rejected him. They rejected him in 1988, rejected him in 2008, and now they rejected him again in 2020. And usually these are the people who get to see somebody up close. And their response to seeing Biden up close was, he's not a president. So Obama leaned in heavy after Bernie did well in Nevada. Deep state hated Bernie. They wanted it to be Buttigieg or Harris. Buttigieg couldn't do well amongst minority voters. So that meant he was going to be persona non grata. Harris was already DOA. So that meant if the choice was Bernie or Biden, Deep state was going to intervene and support Biden, and Obama was their guy to do so. Now, they didn't really need to do a whole lot because, again, Buttigieg and Bernie to some degree, but Buttigieg especially had no appeal to minority voters. But they had to get involved because Bernie was increasingly picking up Mexican-American voters, and that meant he could sweep in the West, Arizona, New Mexico, Texas, California. And they couldn't afford that to happen, so they used his historic weakness with black voters and just had Obama push every single button. And they just sort of pushed Bloomberg out because it was clear Bloomberg wasn't going to be able to make it either. So if we had listened to that warning signal in the early, if the Democrats had, then Biden never gets nominated. Totally ahistorical and unparalleled. But there's no question they know about the scale and scope of the dirt. And especially, I mean, Hunter Biden in some of these things is talking about CIA involvement. He's talking about him being on the ground and being connected to major security figures in a corrupt way in various governments who end up getting executed, including in China, or getting arrested. This is a degree of corruption that really is still kind of shocking.
It is. I have to say, I have seen some of the pictures, and they are profoundly shocking. I mean, I don't want to see them, and I don't urge anybody to look for them because they are deeply disturbing. But I'm afraid, we may find, if investigations do happen, that we're going to hear an awful lot more about this. I mean, does anybody understand how dangerous it is to have a president who is as compromised as this? I mean, the leverage there must be over him must be huge, because it's not just the deep state in Washington that must know all about this. I mean, he's been the vice president. He's been in, I think I'm right in saying he was the chair of the Foreign Relations Committee at one time. It must be universally known amongst all the big intelligence agencies of all the great powers, and the Russians undoubtedly have a file this high. The Chinese have probably an even bigger file about him. I mean, it's incredibly, I would have thought, unwise to risk the United States with a president who's got this kind of thing hanging over him. I mean, did this never really occur to people? I mean, was it so important to stop Bernie that they were going to risk Biden? I mean, I'm just asking.
Yeah, I mean, I think he symbolizes, personalizes the institutionalized corruption of both incompetence and lack of character in at least the American deep state apparatus. And it's been an atrophying institution now for decades. Their post-Cold War adjustment was not a smart one. It was an attempt to create a unipolar empire. It was kind of the opposite of what John Kennedy was trying to do in the early 1960s, for which he got assassinated. And to some degree, aspects of the deep state never recovered from, rather than embracing Kennedy's attempts to find a mediated balance in a so-called Cold War era. With his famous peace speech not long before he was killed, where he went into the long history of, what creates the Russian mindset, as an example, all the people that died in the Great War, what they call the Great Patriotic War, etc. It was a classic blown opportunity, and then the assassination of Robert Kennedy. So that put the deep state kind of back to begin with, and American policies back to begin with. But it's gotten worse since then. And when after the banking collapse of 2008, we didn't allow a natural purge to take place. Instead, we, like right now in Bitcoin and crypto, there's a natural purge taking place because nobody's intervening to prop somebody up. So the scammers, the frauds, the people that really aren't credible or don't turn out to be credible are getting exposed, and the stronger, better actors are are going to be able to sustain themselves. That's what should happen. We didn't, when we decided in 2008 we weren't going to let the marketplace deal with what the banks did. We've been still in a sort of lethargic recovery position ever since. I mean, Japan kind of been that way since the 1990s. And now they're seeing unprecedented things like assassinations. So I think in aggregate, the fact that Biden is even president, a walking, talking dementia candidate who personifies Caligula-level corruption in the American political apparatus, both personal and familial, tells you a lot about how badly positioned the American deep state is. They still have a lot of power, but they have neither the integrity nor the competence to manage that power effectively. And the only question becomes, how many of the rest of us have to suffer for the disastrous outcome of this? Because, I agree, it's shocking the degree to which they didn't seem to care about the scale and scope of his corruption.
Absolutely. Can I just say on this question of incompetence, we've had a report, I think it was in the Financial Times, about the arms shipments to Ukraine. And it is extremely disturbing. I mean, it talks about, weapons in vast quantities being shipped to southern Poland, then taken to the border, and then distributed amongst trucks, private cars, sort of rows of cars and things. You just hand them out. And of course, now they're appearing apparently on the deep web in all sorts of places. There's talk that, 2 howitzers have been sold to the Russians. There's some rumors, which, by the way, I'm very careful about, but there's some rumors that one of these multiple rocket launch systems that the US has been supplying, that's been sold to the Russians as well. I mean, but the underlying story is of just shoveling weapons, losing track of them. Nobody's in charge. Nobody has any control. There's no real supervision, no accounting, no monitoring. I mean, it is really disturbing. And, irrespective of what you think of US intervention in Ukraine, I mean, the US of JFK's day, I have to say, did do this kind of thing very differently and a lot better. I mean, you sent arms to South Vietnam, and they tended to stay in South Vietnam. And we're particularly worried about this, as you can imagine, in Europe, because of course, Ukraine is in Europe, and we're having all these refugees coming from Ukraine, and we've got they've given them visa status that they can come in and out and do all kinds of things here. So we're particularly concerned about how this is going to play out for us.
Well, I think we were probably one of the first people to discuss this publicly right at the time, which was that this is going to lead to massive arms laundering. That, just as the whole Ukrainian financial aid package, that 2/3 or 80% of it is just deep state money laundering. A pretext by which to get money to their friends and allies, often staying in the U.S., not even reaching actual Ukrainian hands. And when it does reach Ukrainian hands, somebody makes their mistress, minister of such and such, as apparently just happened. And then all the continue. I mean, when Ukraine it's just one debacle after the other from a public relations perspective. Between losing arms. Now, I think some of this was intentional. Like when you see sets of arms that are being sent over that don't make sense, either because it's unlikely Ukrainians will be able to train on them well enough to use them quickly, or they're the kind that are difficult to transport without being spotted and taken out, or that they're the kind that just don't fit the battlefield. That's somebody, a defense contractor, who got it included as a way to launder guns to someone else, and just using Ukrainian middlemen. Again, one of the top 10 corrupt countries in the world. So there's a reason why there are 31 biolabs there. It's a country notorious for its corruption. It's a country where they do put up, I'm going to make my mistress minister of whatever, in ways that people just look at the photo and they're like, I'm not sure that person quite qualifies for that position necessarily, and has nothing in there, has a Hunter Biden type resume. You're like, why is he an expert at Burisma oil suddenly? So we're just, it's just, it's like a bad comedy combined with bad drama. I mean, it's like a parody, and you often can't even satire some of this stuff. I mean, like Ukraine saying we're going to take down the Catherine the Great statue and, purge everything that's Russian or connected to Russia. And then we're going to put up a statue of a gay porn star to replace. I mean, it's like, what? It's like one thing after the next after the next. They're releasing people who like to sexually assault mothers in front of their kids by holding their gun to the baby's head, like the Tornado Division folks that they just released. I mean, this is just like, it's stuff that you read and you can't, like, you have to double check it with 10 sources because you can't believe that story is actually true. And then yet it is.
It is.
And so with each one of these, and then the big question is, what happens when one of these U.S. weapons ends up used against Americans? That goes back to the Obama administration, where they thought, hey, we'll flood Mexican drug cartels with guns in some supposed means to control guns or support gun control or something else, and then ended up being used against other Americans, including American officers. And they had to try to cover it up and everything about it, about their operations. We're just doing it on a much bigger, much broader scale. And that's where I would say, like, when you look at projecting out over the next 6 weeks, 6 months, it's very hard to see probabilities of anything getting better for either the deep state side or the Democratic side. And I get that triggers people's paranoia that there might be a really big October surprise beyond a Trump indictment, some sort of another, justification for a lockdown, another virus, another something else. I just think that they've exhausted the credibility and confidence of the American people in their policies, and to such a degree that they're going to just get crushed, and aren't really going to be able and capable of necessarily pulling that off. But the joke that is Ukraine, with the arms laundering, with the prisoner releases, with the military debacle, with the overt and open corruption, all of these are just going to keep coming back at us. So not only the economic war backfired, not only has the geopolitical war backfired, we lost Mexico, we lost Brazil, we lost India, we lost Indonesia. We didn't gain them as allies, we lost them. And like one of the popular super chat questions was BRICS. I mean, every day a new country is announcing it. I mean, Saudi Arabia chooses on the eve of Biden's visit. And again, the Biden administration has a lot of neoliberals in it who don't like Saudi Arabia, particularly don't like MBS. They help push the whole thing about the Washington Post reporter, definitely that's in quotes, who, went into an embassy and didn't come out. Well, it didn't come out in one person, put it that way. They help propagate all that. And now we're going to go beg to MBS. Hey, forget all that stuff where we were making you out to be a dangerous dictator and, killing your enemies all around the world. And please, 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 make more oil. He's not going to. And the day before, or 2 days before, that Biden is coming to visit, Saudi Arabia announced, I think yesterday, that they're looking at joining BRICS, so that they're really trying to create a commodity-driven currency that's an alternative to the dollar and its global dominance worldwide. And that's a shoe, as you mentioned, is yet to fall. What happens when the dollar truly loses its global dominance? That has a wide range of ripple effects in the U.S. economy. Long-term might have some advantages, but short-term, painful. And so everything I look at says this is going to get a lot uglier before it gets any prettier.
Absolutely. Can I just say, I mean, you're absolutely right that the Saudis are now talking about joining the BRICS. And of course, Putin has confirmed that the BRICS are looking at setting up an alternative reserve currency based on a basket of BRICS currencies. Now, if Saudi Arabia joins the BRICS and starts demanding payment for its oil in that BRICS reserve currency based alternative reserve currency, well, the dollar is for the first time going to be in serious trouble. I mean, that is that's now a real danger looming on the horizon, and it's not that far off. And again, I don't really know what response, if any, the administration has. I have to say this: I think MBS comes across to me as a pretty ruthless character. I think he probably would say to himself, well, these people, the Democrats, have said, absolutely horrible things about me in the past. But ultimately, if it's in my interests, if it is my country's interests to stick with the US, I will do so, because ultimately what I want to do is I want to be in power. I want to stay in power as Crown Prince and then King of Saudi Arabia. And the US, up to now, has been the reliable guarantor. But I am looking at this administration. I'm looking at how it's run. I'm looking at the debacle that there was in Afghanistan. I'm looking at the debacle that's coming in Ukraine. And I don't trust these people to protect me in that kind of way. I say to myself, who's got himself better organized at the end of the day? This bunch or the other side, the Chinese and the Russians. Now, again, this would have been inconceivable in JFK's day. I mean, it wouldn't have been a contest that the King of Saudi Arabia would be looking to end or distance his country from the US. I mean, King Faisal, who was the king at that time, it just wouldn't even have crossed his mind. So, I mean, and that tells you how bad things in some ways have become. And we're talking about a debacle, and you mentioned, the war. I mean, the last 48, 72 hours in Ukraine have been extraordinary, because we're now getting a sense that the whole Ukrainian position in Donbass is collapsing. Literally, it's difficult at the moment to keep up with what's going on, but towns and settlements are now falling to the Russians like ninepins. And the Ukrainian army in Donbass is disintegrating. And it looks like, if there's going to be an October surprise, it's going to be an October surprise in Ukraine with a sort of military collapse in Ukraine, because it's a big country. So what happens in Donbass may take a little while to get through. But I was reading a very interesting article in, of all places, National Review, which is said, how does the administration cope with the collapse of two American-backed armies in a year? Afghanistan, now Ukraine. How does it do it?
Well, I think that's, if I thought of the deep state was smart, and my bet was originally for, and we have had some military intervention, but not on a broad scale, I would have focused on Africa. It's a place where you can intervene without, well, as Lavrov joked, he goes, if the war really bothers you, just pretend it's happening in Africa, then you won't care. That routine. So, but that seems smarter to me because that's a more manageable, controllable situation, whether it was Ethiopia, where the civil war continues to rage, whether it was Somalia, which has been a non-functioning state in many levels for quite some time. Someplace like that, and especially to rewrite the Rwanda script that was the most damaging to the neoliberal reputation of the Clinton administration. And I still think that's a lot more likely than trying to create a conflict over China. I just don't see that. I get that there are hawks around, like some of the Defense Department people were in Kennedy's era, where they were filled with arrogance about what they could achieve and thought they could win a nuclear war and so forth. Some of those people do exist within the Pentagon. But as you note, when's the last time America had a military success? They would say that Serbia was a success, Yugoslavia was a success for them, but that's 1999. So, I mean, at this point, Iraq 2 was a disaster. Libya, Syria, both disasters. Afghanistan a disaster, now Ukraine a disaster. And for Ukraine, they had 8 years to prepare them. And they had land that was well designed, that had military fortifications designed for it going back to the Cold War. So, and yet they're still, and Russia's using a small percentage of their military power, and of course not even using their most powerful weapons, thankfully. But if they can't hold off there, they can't win in that context in a proxy battle. They couldn't hold Afghanistan. They couldn't hold Iraq. They couldn't hold Libya. They couldn't hold Syria.
Yeah.
How are they going to dominate anywhere else outside of, what Reagan did was he went into Grenada, right? So maybe we can find some tiny island to invade and protect for democracy or whatever. Come up with maybe make it a woke story. They attack the trainees in some small island we haven't heard of, and we go in to intervene and save the rights of transvestites for woke America and show military power really matters. I mean, I'll give Reagan credit. That was like Grenada was so obvious, but it worked. He got out of Lebanon, and cleaned up in Grenada, and we didn't get for all the criticism of Reagan, he mostly de-escalated military involvement of the U.S. Directly around the globe, not escalated it. Exactly. Much like Eisenhower, there was a lot of criticism, coups and other things like that, John Bolton style policies and politics, but not direct military intervention of the kind that LBJ had done, and the kind Harry Truman had done, and the kind FDR had done, and the kind of Woodrow Wilson had done. Every Democratic major president is prior, other than John Kennedy or Jimmy Carter.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So I mean, I think I agree. I don't see how we can possibly think about militarily engaging China when we can't win in Afghanistan and Ukraine, in Iraq. So I just can't conceive that as a practical possibility. I hope it's just rhetoric, coming out rather than the rest. I think there's been some misapprehension in some parts of the anti-war left about Tucker Carlson's anti-China in terms of its model, in terms of on economic issues. The idea that in geopolitical power, he has never called for military intervention in China, and there's nobody on the populist right that's calling for military intervention in China. That's not the case. There's people who don't like China as a model, and sometimes, God bless them, it seems like the anti-war left has a tendency to, if they're anti-American, somehow they're magically good. It's like back to the old Soviet Cold War days. And I think there's issues with China, but that's a separate matter for another day. I can't see us militarily engaging them. So I agree. I think losing Ukraine means the end of sort of deep state globalist empire politics at a meaningful level. I think digital currencies are off the table. I think their confidence that they economically control the world is off the table. I think their ability to militarily enforce their policies is greatly limited. And I don't know how the scary thing is, how do you respond when you're desperate and defeated?
Yeah. I mean, that's actually, you're leading me directly to the question that I wanted to ask, because the other thing that, and this is what brings us to an issue which I particularly feel strongly about, which is that the other problem with this administration, and we've discussed it in previous programs, is its absolutely reckless attitude to law and to the law within the United States. Now they're going to get desperate because they're going to lose badly in November. There's worries about what comes afterwards. There's no clear successor or alternative to Biden, and Biden is a disaster. The economy is going hideously wrong, and all the foreign wars are also going wrong too. So you have that combined with an administration that isn't, shall we say, scrupulous about following the law. In fact, on the contrary, it has an extraordinary disregard of the law. It sees law as a very functional thing, something that it controls and uses. It doesn't have any real sense of the rule of law. And we see attacks now on the Supreme Court of the United States. I mean, I should say there was a very, very disturbing article in the Financial Times. Now, the Financial Times, I've come to realize, is very close to the thinking of the administration, that there's clearly some kind of connection there, and it's used to a great extent as a kind of conduit for getting the administration's opinions across in Europe, but it was talking about the politicization of the Supreme Court and how the Supreme Court has undermined, supposedly, the predictability of the American legal system because it's dared to overturn Roe and Wade. I mean, that was basically what it was saying, and that this is going to have all kinds of impacts on the economic attractiveness of the US, because very bizarre things, but it's difficult to interpret that as anything other than a signal that somebody is going to come for the Supreme Court. And is this perhaps going to be the October surprise, that we're going to start seeing some attempt to do something about the Supreme Court? The president, for example, nominating new justices. Because can you explain, is it correct? I've heard that that the fact that there's 9 justices is only a convention, that there's no actual rule that says that you can't have more. I mean, it's a very important convention, and conventions, as we know in Britain, can be of constitutional importance and significance and are not to be cast aside, frivolously. But is an attack on the Supreme Court on the way?
Yes, it is. And to the super chat question asking about BRICS, it's Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. And the idea is that it's aggregate control over population and resources make it an effective potential challenge to the U.S. To just briefly that question. But you're seeing basically an open call for violence against the justices. I mean, a Harvard law professor was tweeting today about how they should be constantly exposed and constantly embarrassed. Justice Kavanaugh went to a restaurant, and because he ate at the restaurant, they flooded the restaurant with fake reservations to try to cause it economic damage. They've continued to try to stalk people. They arrested a man who wanted to kill Kavanaugh and had plans to do so and was in a physical position to do so. So they seem to be wanting it. And if anything happens to any of those conservative justices, other than maybe Roberts, but that's a different story, there'll be massive political blowback because it'll look like an attempt to substitute and stack the court. So that should be a Democratic risk point, but it's not, because they are so enraged that this institution they have used to undemocratically rewrite social policy in America is now no longer in their monopolized control. It's still an institution that's far more elitist than it is populist. It just isn't elitist on all the same issues, particularly of matters of religion and matters of guns that the liberal elites hold. But you're seeing that the mask has dropped in terms of all of this. And you're seeing aspects of the Biden administration try to create a constitutional crisis by talking about putting abortions on federal property in states that ban it, put abortion boats right off of the waterways, because it's federal waterways, to provide abortion services, to say that the military is going to continue to offer abortions on military facilities, that even in states where it's illegal or a crime. You've seen ICE the other day said that they're going to guarantee the right to abortion. So if someone's in ICE custody, they will be transferred to a state where abortion is legal if they want one or request one. So you're seeing an open, overt challenge by the administration, welcoming and inviting the stalking, protest, and the doxing of justices at their homes and in other public places. Calls by the legal establishment. I mean, right now, I think they did a recent poll. Majority of Democrats favored getting rid of the Supreme Court altogether. So, I mean, it's ironic because it's an institution that has mostly served elitist interest over time. It's not, the Supreme Court's made far more bad decisions than it has good. Dred Scott helped give us the Civil War. The decisions in the 1890s helped create segregationist America, which never should have happened after the 14th Amendment. It went too far in busing and a range of issues in the 50s and 60s that caused worsened the racial conflict in the country rather than resolved it. So for all the good decisions that were mixed in there were a lot of bad decisions too, where they overreached. And then they clearly overreached in the context of abortion policy already, and the Supreme Court just stepping back from it has caused the left to be enraged. So I think, here's the practical issue. They don't have the votes. They don't have the votes in the Senate. They were better up. There was a reason why Biden dodged the question during the general election in 2020, because stacking the court is not popular. It never has been. And the left is just dropping mask after mask, that they only care about power, that they're statists at heart. And I'm not talking about the anti-war, anti-establishment left, the Aaron Mates, the Matt Taibbis, the Jimmy Dores, the Glenn Greenwalds, the Michael Tracys. Talking about the neoliberal establishment. And the neoliberal establishment has exposed they only care about power, and they'll sacrifice any principle to get there. Everything they accuse Trump of, they have done, and done it on steroids. And I think it will just lead to their continuing discrediting in the court of public opinion amongst the ordinary American.
I have to say, is it true? Because this is the thing I've been reading in parts of the British media, which covers America, that Biden has actually been criticized by the kind of left-wing Democrats you're saying, not the real left-wing Democrats, for being too soft in his response to the decision of the Supreme Court. Because I have to say, when I read that, I was incredulous. Because it did seem to be exactly what you said. He's not abiding by the decision. He's doing everything he possibly can to negate it. I mean, it's an extraordinary attitude to, a judgment of the High Court. But is it true that there are people who are saying that, he's actually undermining, rather that he's being too soft, that he's not, presenting a strong enough challenge to this decision?
Oh yes. They expected certain parts of the establishment, neoliberal, but in particular legal academy, but also high-ranking political officers, expected him to just stop the decision, to just reverse it, to say we're not going to enforce the Supreme Court's decision. We're going to unilaterally recognize a universal right to abortion in every state, and I'm going to enforce it with federal marshals and the military. I mean, that was the mindset within. They thought there was some plan ready to launch that was going to do this, that was just going to ignore the Supreme Court entirely. And so, because Roe v. Wade had become kind of a religious tenet within the left, and within the neoliberal legal left. I mean, to such a degree, last week you had law professors arguing with Senator Hawley about how men can get pregnant. And it's like, you're not really arguing in public. I mean, I get it's a woke position, but this makes you look like a joke amongst the ordinary American. And yet that's exactly what they were doing. And there were parts of the left that celebrated it. Oh, they showed that Senator Hawley, men can get pregnant. I mean, they don't understand how disconnected they are. It's the same reason they couldn't anticipate the same wokester globalist crowd that Russia would not embrace wokeism as a value system, that was as foreign as they're like, whoa, no. They're just disconnected. And it's because they live in such a tight bubble. And then that's further enforced and reinforced culturally. I mean, Disney, all these woke kind of movies are movies that are influenced by wokeism, like Marvel in the current era and Star Wars in the current era. Their TV shows are bombing. Their movies are bombing. Their stock is dropping. Well, what was the most popular movie in America this year? The second one of Top Gun. That's like a 1980s throwback. I mean, when patriotism was worthy, proud, enjoyable, just pure 1980s. Just let's take a 1985 movie, put it back on, or shows like Terminal List, they take, the great revenge genres, combined with some Tom Clancy, combined with some military action, old school military action. And it's one of the most popular shows that's ever been on Amazon. That's the cultural desire. And yet these people don't realize it. And so they don't understand that attacking the institution of the Supreme Court so overtly, so brazenly. I mean, FDR did it in the 30s, but only after a sequence of decisions was completely gutting the New Deal. And even then it was high risk, and it was mostly in the legal academy criticized. Now you have leaders of the legal academy welcoming, calling for either stacking the court or getting rid of the court. So any illusion that they care about the rule of law, that they care about these institutions is gone, which, of course, the irony is, as you note, it isn't going to be Roe v. Wade that causes people to second-guess investments in America. It's going to be the Americans stealing people's property and money that's going to be their concerns of investing in America. Abramovich is now going to be bringing suit because they're trying to steal a couple of his planes. There's already suits from, I'm going to get his name wrong, Deripaska. I probably mispronounced it. The Oleg there that's looking at going up to the U.S. Supreme Court on a lot of these issues from old sanctions because there's just been a complete ignoring of any rule of law, any rule of due process. There's people looking at suing over non-payment on Russian debt because of what the U.S. government did to intervene to prevent the payment of it, pretending it was a default when it's not. There's ETFs. I've got inquiries from people who invested in ETFs and Russian stocks holding commodities that got frozen that are Americans, and that was a U.S.-based ETF. They're going to be bringing suit. We'll see if the courts do anything, because sadly the courts believe things like Snake Island. A federal judge in America, say just as they said in Snake Island, F you, believing obvious fake news. But that's the problem for investment in the West is the sanctions policies and stealing stuff and acting like pirates and being proud of it, not the Roe v. Wade decision. What the Roe v. Wade decision has exposed is that the American neoliberals could care less about the rule of law and institutions, which they had already revealed in their Russian sanctions policies.
Well, absolutely. I mean, one of the things that I have to say about the Financial Times article is it was talking about the constitutional right to abortion. And of course, what it doesn't seem to understand is that this is a constitutional right, in inverted commas, that originates entirely from a Supreme Court decision. I mean, it's not, you won't find this in the text of the Constitution itself. I know, I've read it. It's not there. I mean, it just isn't there. So, what the Constitution, what the Supreme Court has given, the Supreme Court has taken away. And, well, I think most lawyers who retain any degree of objectivity, irrespective of what their view about abortion is, they would say this is right, because it's supposed to administer the Constitution. It's not supposed to second guess it or rewrite it or change it. Or that's for the people of the United States to do. And what are the first words of the US Constitution? We, the people, not we, the Democratic Party, we, the liberal justices. It's we, the people. So when you rewrite the Constitution, and you do it in this kind of way, and there's kind of radically rewriting the Constitution, you are taking away from the people a part of their power. That's, I think, something that people need to grasp about the American Constitution. I know people always go on and criticize me for being too, sentimental about the United States, but for a European, for a British person steeped in British common law, as I worked in the Royal Courts of Justice, the Constitution of the United States is an extraordinary document, and one that should be treated with the utmost respect, simply because you believe in a right that people should have a right to abortion. You can't just rewrite it, because there are very, very dangerous consequences if you just rewrite the Constitution to suit your particular whims. Sorry, that was a little bit of a sermon from me, but I think, as I said, maybe because I've never been governed by a constitution like that, it's something that perhaps I feel about more, perhaps even than obviously than an awful lot of Americans do. It's not just a utilitarian document that you can just play around with as you choose. Anyway, coming back to our more, mundane topics. I mean, if they're not going to go against the Supreme Court, and by the way, if we go back to what FDR did or tried to do, or said he wanted to do in the 1930s, I think if you know the political history of that time, you will know that it backfired badly against him. And it was one of the major reasons why in 1938 Congress swung to the right. The Democrats didn't lose their majority, but you began to get a sort of conservative majority starting to appear in Congress, and that basically was the end of the momentum behind the New Deal. So if that isn't going to work, if you sort of attacking the Supreme Court isn't going to work, well, you've given us an extraordinary litany of things that they've done, which are, shall we say, legally dubious. What else might they do? They're desperate people. They're prepared to do things which are contrary to the law. It is music to my ears, by the way, that there are people, bondholders, Russian bondholders, who are now seriously thinking about bringing legal claims. And I think they should. And I wish them every success in doing so. But anyway, if that isn't going to work, if attacking the Supreme Court isn't going to work, what are they going to do?
That's the real big question. And that tends to trigger people's worst fears.
Yeah.
So that's where people worry that they'll try to launch another pandemic, do another lockdown, try to do mass mail-in voting. There's concerns that the Biden administration is trying to weaponize its different cabinet positions in order to take over U.S. elections in some disguised manner without legislative authorization or constitutional approval. There is, in fact, there'll be a case before the U.S. Supreme Court. The Supreme Court took for next term. They'll be issued at some point after October that may establish that the states have a monopoly on how presidential elections are done, state legislatures, and that the Congress can't intervene in that context. That appears to be what the Constitution itself says, but that, you know, the court may come in and clean that up. But in the interim, the fear is that there'll be some sort of election meddling, some form of sudden lockdown set of policies over a new pandemic, another conflict somewhere in the globe, completely unleashing illegal immigration into the United States, an indictment or October surprise of Trump. That's where people are looking, because they're assuming that the establishment, in a state of desperation, will not forego and forfeit power and would rather find some illicit means to seize it one last time. And the much as you had the back-to-back assassinations of the Kennedy brothers in the 60s, the assassination of Martin Luther King, the assassination of Malcolm X, all within 5 years, and then in the subsequent impeachment and scandal over over President Nixon, that 10-year run did what I think. The reason why I don't think a lot of that desperation will be done is that almost destroyed deep state power. Like, I often see people say, "Oh, the deep state's never lost in America." That's not really true. They tried to establish the deep state after the Civil War. It failed. They tried to establish a real deep state after World War I. It failed. And at various points, they have had blowback, and probably the biggest blowback against them was, you know, all those assassinations and then Nixon's impeachment created the reformist Congress that gave us the Church Committee that exposed name another democratic country that held extensive hearings that exposed its own malfeasance of its own deep state, including recent events, to the globe. That's what happened between 1974 and 1978. That's why we know what we know about MK Ultra. That's why we know what we know about coups and plots to overthrow people. That's why we know about a range of illicit behaviors, including foreign and domestic assassinations. So if they have any institutional memory, they're on the Kissinger side rather than the kindergartner side, to steal Putin's phraseology, in terms of ways to exit this. And so hopefully they find a graceful exit that maintains some aspect of their power in their viewpoint, at least for the time being, and doesn't gamble everything on some big public policy debacle, like any of those things that I mentioned before, because I don't think any of them can sustain their power. They're losing power at a record pace and a record rate. That when you have somebody on YouTube going through somebody's channels over the last, say, 2 years and looking for any commentary they can use to flag that channel to keep them off for just a week, that's the sign of a desperate deep state apparatus and its allies and apparatchiks. That's not the sign of strength. That's the sign of weakness, almost futility. And so I think it's only a matter of time before a lot of the globalist deep state takes a major step back. They had to win Russia, and they didn't. and everything keeps blowing back against them in multiple directions. And I just don't see an exit ramp that they are able to gracefully exit and sustain power. They could gracefully exit and maintain some bit of power. And if the Kissinger wing wins out, that's what will happen. If the kindergartner wing wins out, we may experience some really bad policies in the interim, but it could be the end and a complete implosion of their political power, because I think they face a degree of credibility questions that has never really occurred since the 1970s.
Absolutely. Well, can I just say something about that? Because again, my political memory does extend back amazingly to the early 70s. I mean, if you lived in Greece at that time, you became politically very, shall we say, you learned your politics very quickly. And I can remember some of the deep state people in the United States, deep state of that period. I mean, there was Richard Helms, who was the CIA director. There was, of course, J. Edgar Hoover, who was still around in the early 70s, incredibly, and he was the director of the FBI. Now, these were very sinister, very powerful people. Nobody would ever say that they weren't also extremely clever people. I mean, they were impressive. They were dangerous. They were sinister, if you like, but they were clever. I have to say, look at the people around today who are running the deep state. They're not of that caliber. So the deep state in those days knew how to take a step back and preserve itself. And you talk about the Kissinger wing. Of course, he is in a way a throwback to that period. I mean, that was when he was around. That's when he, it seems astonishing to say this, but that was when he was Secretary of State and, Nixon's national security advisor. He's from the early 70s. You look at people, the sort of people around today. I mean, I forget the name of the person who's running the CIA today. Is it Haspel? I can't remember, but whoever she is, I mean, or Avril Haines, who's the director of national intelligence. She's not at all up to that sort of level of skill. So it's not surprising that they ship arms to Ukraine and then instantly lose them. I mean, it doesn't surprise me that kind of thing happens. And I have to say, I don't think they have the intelligence to say, well, we've got to take a step back and preserve things, because if we don't, we risk losing it all. I don't think that that's the kind of ability these people have. But actually, in some ways, that does make them more dangerous, because if they don't have the intelligence to take a step back, isn't there a risk that they'll go too far in the other direction?
Yeah, I mean, so like the super chat question, this is a product of intellectual incest. It's a Habsburg problem. There's a reason why their jaws and other things started looking a little weird as things goes on. Turns out too many uncles and nieces is not a good marital solution. And ultimately that had effect on their ability to sustain their empire. And here it's just been intellectual incestuous behavior of just having people that grew up weak and trained in a way that maximizes weakness, not strength, and just culturally corrodes them. I remember watching a partial documentary during the 2016 campaign, and they had all the Hillary Clinton campaign people around in Brooklyn. And it was like I was recently in Brooklyn, and I went over to the Russian tea room, and beautiful, great place in Manhattan. And on their website, they have like a long apology for the Ukrainian war. It's like, you're a restaurant. Why do you care about this? But in Brooklyn, it looked like a caricature. I mean, there was a lot of guys there that clearly only drink soy. And it's like, this was the Clinton campaign headquarters in 2016. And seeing those people, as soon as I saw that, I was like, that's the campaign team? Yeah. She's got no chance. And that's who runs the CIA these days. That's who runs the State Department these days. That's who runs the 7th floor at the FBI and high-ranking positions in the Pentagon these days. Somebody pointed out, when Eisenhower, who actually won a war, he had this like 6 medals on his thing. Milley, who keeps losing wars, has like 100. It's like it's a sad, pitiful era of institutional power in the West. The globalists are just, They can be powerful, they can be manipulative, but by no means are they intelligent or competent or have any character. It's not just their moral compass is broken, their intellectual capacity is not present, and we're just all experiencing the consequences of it. Hopefully, the consequences don't get severely worse before we're able to use these events to purge them of their political power.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I mean, we are certainly in extraordinary times in the US, and there was, I mean, we've been getting sort of chats and things, and the very bizarre things that are going on. So that the Italian Prime Minister Draghi apparently wants to resign, but isn't able to. I mean, I haven't followed this story exactly because this is all coming through as we speak. But I mean, is this for real? I mean, is this how things are done at this time? But of course, the great danger is that whilst we are so disorganized, it's important to remember that the other side is not. And I mean, I again, there was another chat about the rupee ruble trade. The world doesn't just wait for us. We have to adapt ourselves to them. Now, I come back to this. I think the United States, a lot of the things that Robert was talking about things that are going wrong, things that have been lost. I actually think it's the liberation. It's the cutting off of the bonds that are holding America down, actually. I mean, I think that America doesn't need a government that's worrying about what's going on in all sorts of places in different parts of the world. It needs a government that runs things well in America, and then America will be fine, as it was and as it can be. In Europe, we don't have that kind of luxury. That's the truth of it. We're a group of very dysfunctional countries, relatively small countries, and we've got ourselves entangled in this web of the European Union now. And we're talking about the rupee ruble deal that's coming, which is going to be a big thing. It's going to be a very, very big thing. But compare this with the situation now with energy. A couple of days ago, on a live stream that I did on the Duran, somebody was saying, that the European Commission is going to try to hoard, is going to try to sort of take control of energy across the entire European Union. It's going to try and centralize control of energy because of the energy shortages we're going to have in Europe. And I think this is absolutely what they are intending to do. And we got proof of this already today, because I'm starting to read articles appearing about how the European Union is now already talking about the importance of member states not hoarding energy. So a country like Hungary, which agreed to the sanctions against Russian oil, but thought it was protecting its position by getting carve-outs, is now going to find that those protections that it thought it had, those carve-outs, don't actually mean anything, because the European Union is going to come and say, look, you've got oil, Luxembourg doesn't, so you've got to give some of your oil so that we can pass it on to Luxembourg. That's what's going to happen. Now, what that means is that you're going to create shortages in some countries in Europe, you have shortages in some countries in Europe, and then you're going to make those shortages systemic for every country in Europe. That is what that kind of centralization is going to do to you. Whereas, of course, in the United States, and we come back to the Constitution of the United States and the way it protects interstate commerce and things of that kind. And, Robert, you know an awful lot more about that than I do. Things are done very differently because you do have a genuine, unified, natural, organic market, which, of course, in Europe, we don't. what do you think is going to happen on the energy front in the United States? What is the administration going to, what havoc, what further havoc is it going to try and wreak there?
Well, I mean, you see some of the answer in what's happening in Europe and Asia, in the sense that Japan's going to turn back on a lot of its nuclear reactors. Europe's talking, Germany's talking about turning back on its coal-powered plants. France is trying to increase its nuclear capable production. But in the U.S., the capacity to just quickly turn on the spigot just shows the lack of understanding that some of our elites have, or political class elites have. That's just not something that's that practical. Usually takes 18 months or so, 12 to 18 months or so, just to ramp up production. And they're not in the mood to do that. They're not, when Biden's threatening windfalls tax, is attacking them rhetorically, is saying that they should do a EU style give back to the people, whatever money they make. That's not going to flow well with the U.S. oil developers. They're probably not going to explore much. Biden pulled a lot of permits, including the Keystone Pipeline and others. They see this administration as invariably hostile to their economic and political interest, and they're not interested in gambling on a temporary solution by trying to build more wells, increase production that could backfire on them long term. And so I think the energy problems are here to stay until there's a new administration in 2025 in the U.S. as well as the rest of the world. And I think the ability for the U.S. to continue to try to supply from its strategic petroleum oil reserve, which is already at near recent record lows because of how much Biden has already diminished it by trying to help Europe and the West, is just won't be a viable option ongoing as people pay higher and higher prices. They're not amenable to it. We saw it in the polls in Europe start to reflect what has always been the case in the U.S., which is when you ask people, do you support the war in Ukraine? They say, sure. And then you say, well, will you be willing to pay higher gas prices or food prices for it? In America, it's always been no. No fly zone, no. Not willing to escalate and risk nuclear war, no. Risk a direct war with Russia, no. But now Europe is, more and more European countries are following that same pattern. Zero Hedge did a whole breakdown of the polling data, which showed that even in Europe, people were not willing to pay more at the pump or anywhere else to support the war in Ukraine. And that as you went down the economic scale, the more the opposition to war got. Not only in terms of where you were in Europe, Southern and Eastern Europe being more opposed than Western Europe, but also within Western Europe, the more working class you were, the more you were opposed to paying a higher price for war. And as that spreads, that's going to continue to be a problem, but it's a problem these political elites can't fix because there is no quick energy fix. They diluted them, and I think all of it goes back to the same core problem: the illusion of control of central planners. They proved their illusion of control in the pandemic. They proved their illusion of control now in terms of economic global policy with Russian sanctions, and they're proving on a daily basis their inability to handle the fallout. I mean, like Yellen suggesting a cap on prices. How's that going to work? How are we going to enforce it? I mean, it's ludicrous. It's people in the economic space, Doomberg, some others, are like, this is some of the most inane policies. These are people that don't care politically about Russia, one or the other. They're saying this is just insane economic policy. You can't even do this. This is unachievable. These are people so accustomed to believing in the illusion of their own control that it's going to be as much of a shock to them as it is to the public, just how incapable and incompetent they actually are.
Absolutely. Well, I think perhaps just as a historical thing, it was the United States that created for the first time a modern market in energy. If you go back to the 19th century, I mean, that's why you see all these oil majors are American. They may not be very attractive institutions, maybe, but Exxon, Standard Oil. I mean, it was in the United States that they created a unified commercial market in oil, in energy products, which were, of course, the fundamental driver, first of the US industrial miracle, because it was, of the 1890s and onwards, and of course of the the growth of the global economy thereafter. It's very weird to see this current administration, an American administration, completely oblivious to all the lessons of how that was done, because of course that wasn't done by government notice. It was done by corporate, not in a very attractive way, but it was done by organically through corporate initiatives. And very interestingly, very, very interestingly, you see the administration attacking the energy industry for an energy crisis that the administration has itself created. I have to say, of all the weird things this administration has done, for me, that was the most bizarre of all. I mean, I just said to myself, what planet are these people on? Do they really not understand how preposterous they must seem, obviously to the people who run the industry, but surely to people in the United States as well, who are having to pay these sky-high prices?
Absolutely. No doubt about it. And hopefully the exposure of the illusion of control will help evolve into a much safer, peaceable, prosperous world 10 years from now. It's just the interim period, maybe a rather brutal period to experience in the United States and the West, and maybe in other parts of the world as Sri Lanka and other countries are exposing. And but I think the World Economic Forum took a major setback. And I think in the end, at least Democratic political elites here may regret the election fornication of 2020 and its outcome, because Trump was in nowhere nearly as strong to implement a populist version of Trumpism had he won, that he will be in 2025, because people have seen what globalist elite politics looks like for America, and Americans are not interested in seeing it anymore. And it's likely going to give the populist caucus within the Republican conservative cause more power than ever. And maybe we'll see more alliances and allegiances over time between the populist right and the populist left, like we saw in France, where they struck down a COVID passport because the populist left and the populist right joined together against Macron.
In the parliament. Absolutely. That is a seminal moment. In fact, that's the first time that left and right have come together in that kind of way in France. Now, I don't know what it means for the future, because these are two very bitterly rancorous and hostile camps, even though in terms of what they want and how they want to achieve it, they overlap so much. But as I said, up to now, historically, they've been very antagonistic to each other. But they came together, and it's interesting that they came together on that specific issue. Very interesting, very important, absolutely something to watch. Can I just say that that's the other thing about Trump and populism, is that it seems to me that it's actually quite protean in some ways, because it obviously is a movement that originates on the right, but I can also see how it can attract a lot of support from the historic old left and its traditions as well, which are still, I suspect, quite strong amongst some sections of US American society, working class society especially. And I have to say, the idea of Donald Trump winning a 1984 type victory with a Congress with a strong populist minority behind him, with all the experience that he's obviously gained over the last 6 years, well, 8 years it will be by then, be very, very different. It would be a completely different Trump. It would be it would be like an icebreaker. Actually, it will smash through things in incredible ways. It's a question I have been asked now several times on live streams on the Duran. Is there any chance that the United States might quit NATO?
I think if Trump wins in 2024 and the populist caucus grows and expands, at least John Bolton thinks that Trump planned on doing so had he won in 2020. He has said that publicly. So Trump planned on withdrawing the United States from NATO entirely and cutting a range of deals with Russia that Bolton didn't want to have happen. And so I think by 2025, Trump's original skepticism of NATO, for those that don't know, during the 2016 campaign, he suggested getting out of NATO. And he walked it back later after massive pressure. But that was his initial instinct. And I think that there is a high chance he can use the disastrous policies in Ukraine as a effective excuse to get out. Say no more, no mas. We don't need to be extended around the world, around the globe. Not who we are, not what we are. I mean, like with China, Trump was critical of China's on economic policies. Trump did not spend tons of time talking about various internal issues with China. If people go back and look, that wasn't his thing. His thing was China's economically screwing us and he said, good on China. They're advancing their own interests. Time for us to advance our own interests. I think that's where you'll see confrontation, but not on a military level. You'll see a return to sort of, and I even think people in China that didn't like Trump because of his economic tariff policies might be regretting that Trump is not president right now, because they realize that they have better the devil you know than a devil that you don't know what he's going to do tomorrow. And that's the reality. So I think, I think there's a very high chance that if Trump comes into power in 2025, especially with a good number of populists in the House and the Senate, like the J.D. Vances of the world, that we will be out of NATO before his term ends.
On the subject of China, you've got to be very careful not to take some of the anti-Trump things that you sometimes see in the Chinese media too seriously. When the Chinese met Trump, Chinese officials, they liked him. And the reason they liked him is because he was straightforward. And it may surprise people to learn this, but in diplomacy, in high-level diplomacy, it's always a lot better to be straightforward. One of the most telling moments for me in the last couple of months, and I think I've discussed this before in a previous discussion we did, was a meeting. There's a virtual meeting between Xi Jinping and Biden, in which Xi Jinping said to Biden on Taiwan, on this issue of Taiwan, you tell me one thing, but your administration does another. That's the clearest way, the most straight, that's the nearest you will ever get at that level to one leader telling another leader you're lying. So I mean that is not something that the Chinese ever said about Donald Trump, and that's a very important thing to understand. Much better to be openly oppositional, adversarial in diplomacy than to say one thing and to do another. It creates a terrible impression. And by the way, I think that Robert's right. The more I think about it, the logic of the US picking a fight with China is, it makes absolutely no sense. The danger is not that they will intentionally do that. The risk is it may happen because the Chinese have now become so suspicious of what this administration is about. And that would be a real calamity, not just to end up in a fight with China, but to end up in a fight with China that you didn't really plan for and never expected or wanted. That would be, anyway, but we won't go there. We certainly live in exciting times in the US. We say this in every one of these live streams that we do. But I'm going to say this: if the US pulls out of NATO, it'd be fine for the US. It's a continent. It's powerful economy. The effect on Europe will be profound. And I think it will be profound in a way that is unexpected to people. I think it will create peace in Europe. And I'll tell you why. Because it seems to me that what this NATO is doing now, whatever it achieved during the Cold War, the NATO that we have today, it's giving all sorts of little countries all kinds of opportunities to pursue little empire-type building policies, principally against Russia, in the belief that they can do that, and the United States will always come to their rescue. So Lithuania can cut off transit to Kaliningrad, and they feel they're able to do it because the US will come and support them. Now, if that isn't there anymore, if that American guarantee isn't there, why would the US be prepared to go to war over Kaliningrad? But if that isn't there anymore, Lithuania will not do that sort of thing. They wouldn't dare to. And that will create a condition which might bring about peace. And it would certainly not, in my opinion, threaten or provide any kind of danger for the United States itself. That's my own personal view about what it would do. And of course, it's the people who fear peace who probably sense deep down, the truth of what I'm saying. Well, Robert, I think I've exhausted the things I wanted to say. We've been going on for 2 hours, but I don't know whether you have anything you particularly want to bring up and touch on and add to.
No, I mean, I think that covers it. The Viva's out here in Vegas, so about to catch up with him for a little lunch.
Absolutely.
So that'll be fun. So it's probably a good time to wrap.
Yeah.
But I agree. The old Chinese proverb, "May you live in interesting times," whether it's a promise of hope or a curse, as some different folks think. I compare it. We're living to a time comparable to 1919, 1939, 1989. When world-changing, world-shifting events were occurring in live time for us to witness and watch. And what is happening between the last year and a half and over the next year or so will, I think, reshape the globe for generations to come. And hopefully, right and righteousness wins out over darkness and dumbness. But in the interim, we may go through some difficulties to get to the bright path. Sometimes you do have to go through a dark tunnel before you can get to the light. But I do think there's a light at the end of that tunnel that's not an oncoming train.
I absolutely, completely agree with that. Robert, where can people find you?
At vivabarneslaw.locals.com. Best place is just as the Duran.locals.com. Best place to find it. And I even have some of the merch.
Oh, well, there you go. With the American flag. Delighted to see that. Robert, thank you again. It's an honor and a privilege always to have you on our programs. That was a brilliant live stream. And I look forward to having another one again very soon. And can I just say thanks to everybody. There's been lots of questions. We're going to do a dedicated program to catching up with any questions we haven't answered, which I suspect is most of them. But what tends to happen, by the way, when Robert and I get talking is that we sort of run away with our conversations. At least I do. And perhaps, Robert should sometimes rein me in a little. I don't know. But anyway, there we go. But we will do a dedicated program. So don't think that your questions are going to be missed. They won't be. And anyone which are specific to Robert, will make sure that he's made aware of them and he can answer them. And again, don't worry, we will get to them all. So thank you again, Robert. Thank you again, all of you, for listening to us. And this was, I think, a fantastic program.